Welcome back to another edition of Force Friday, where we talk about Star Wars theories, characters, concepts, comparisons, analyzations, collectibles, and more.
And today we're going to be talking about the Sith. Everybody loves a good Sith. You just wake up in the morning, have a cup of coffee, and enjoy a nice Sith. But seriously, what's not to like? Red lightsabers, devil horns, layers and layers of black robes. It's like the theatrical version of a Slayer concert. Anyway, specifically, we're going to be talking about the Rule of Two. Now, the first time I remember hearing about the Rule of Two was at the end of episode 1. Always two there are, a master and an apprentice. And I remember being super irritated by it because all of a sudden it put this confines on what the Sith could be. In my head, I'd always imagined Sith armies and just legions and legions of Sith just going to war. And then this immediately was like, oh, well, we're not going to get that. Not anytime soon anyway. But my reaction to that was a selfish one. And it was a reaction based on my wants and not necessarily about what makes sense for the universe the story takes place in. When you start to analyze the Sith, when you start to think about the philosophy of the Sith, the goal of the Sith, it all starts to have a very logical reasoning and explanation for why there would be the Rule of Two. So let's get into it. The Sith exist for one purpose, power above all else. The power to control and dominate drives the Sith further and further into the dark side, in a never-ending spiral of want and destruction. In order for the Sith to exist, their skills and knowledge must be passed on. Yet with the Sith's basic principles teaching power above all else, multiple Siths trying to work together for any length of time is like a snake eating its own tail. The survival of the Sith is based purely upon something that goes fundamentally against the nature of a Sith. It's a very selfish, self-motivated, self-centered philosophy, yet you can't go on forever. Strong was Yoda with the Force, but even he wasn't that strong. So the only thing that basically overrides one's own selfishness is the need to pass on the order to which they are committed to. But those two ideas are opposing one another. A millennia before the films, the Sith had ruled an empire and engaged in numerous wars with the Jedi. Eventually, the Sith order began to crumble from within, with each Sith pulling for power. But this had ensured only their destruction, and they were decimated by the Jedi, or I should say, greatly defeated. I recently learned that being decimated literally means to be reduced by 1/10. Decimated. I've been using it wrong for a very long time. This is me making a change. One Sith Lord, Darth Bane, survived, realizing that the Sith had brought this on themselves, and as the sole survivor carrying their legacy, Bane came to realize no more than two Sith could exist at any one time. A master to pass on their skills and the legacy of the Sith, and an apprentice to learn from their master and carry on the Sith into the future. Bane studied ancient Sith documents, coming to realize the Sith's very doctrine was built on the idea of a master and an apprentice. He was also enthralled by the idea of a dyad in the Force, two Force users who share a bond through space and time, two who are one. However, a dyad had not been seen even then in many years and could not be created. The Rule of Two, a master and an apprentice, is in its way meant to resemble a dyad, although even Bane knew this was a pale imitation. At some point, the Jedi learned of Bane's existence. They learned of his Rule of Two, and eventually he was killed, though whether by Jedi or his own apprentice is unknown. Either way, the Jedi believed that the Sith had been vanquished forever, and Bane's apprentice disappeared into the myths of galactic history, passing down his skills to an apprentice of his own and ensuring the Sith's survival. The Rule of Two was designed to channel the Sith's need for power and dominance. As soon as the apprentice began to grow more powerful than the master, they usually killed them, taking their rightful place as the galaxy's most powerful Sith Lord and finding an apprentice of their own. Bane knew that because of their nature, the Sith would always try to kill one another. The Rule of Two simply ensured that the dominant Sith at any given time would be the most powerful and created the hunger and hatred in the apprentice that would ensure the Sith's survival. These attempts did not always work, and a failed apprentice was usually killed by the master for their weakness. Apprentices could also be replaced if a more powerful successor was found, as with Sidious. With their very nature meaning that one would eventually die, many have come to wonder how two Sith Lords could even function together, let alone pass along skills and knowledge. The nature of the relationship is one of distrust, contempt, and subterfuge. A master must always ensure their own power and status, remaining wary of the apprentice's possible betrayal. An apprentice must ensure they are worthy of the master and the Sith, or they'll be replaced. An apprentice betraying the master was not something to be taken lightly. Only when an apprentice was sure of their own strength and power could they risk making a move. The Rule of Two came to define the Sith's very philosophy. It ensured their numbers remained small, forcing Sith to work together to avoid the detection of the Jedi. It meant only the most powerful and vicious could carry on their legacy, and it mandated survival, cunning, and manipulation, something Sith like Darth Sidious came to personify. Ancient Sith shrines and temples also functioned around this rule. One Force user could not enter alone. To gain access, a master and an apprentice had to work together. Despite this, the Sith were not above using other dark side users to their ends. During the Clone Wars, Count Dooku secretly trained Asajj Ventress as his Sith apprentice under the guise of her being a dark side assassin, eventually planning to overthrow Sidious and rule the galaxy for himself. Sidious became aware of this, and knowing he was not as powerful as his master, Dooku obeyed and attempted to have Ventress killed. Just as the light does not belong to the Jedi, the dark does not belong to the Sith. The Force is a universal constant, created, fed, and sustained by all living things. Darkness in response to light is natural. This meant that as long as those strong enough to wield the Force existed, the possibility of other dark side users would too. As Emperor, Sidious knew this and twisted it to his advantage. Knowing he and Vader alone could not control the galaxy's Force users, he found a former Jedi temple guard who had become disillusioned with the Jedi during the war, gradually becoming angry with their complacency and narrow doctrines. Sidious promised him the chance for revenge, and this Jedi became the Grand Inquisitor. Various other Force users were brought under the Emperor's control and trained in the ways of the dark side by Vader to hunt down remaining Jedi and watching for signs of them returning. I think, at least in my personal opinion, the light side and the dark side of the Force often get confused with the Jedi and the Sith, but they're not the same thing. The Jedi do lean more towards the light, but I think they're all capable of using the dark side. You just have to be very skilled and very careful. Light and dark is balance because everybody has light and dark within them. The brighter something shines, the heavier the shadow. But the Sith are absent of the light. That's what makes them throw the Force out of balance. If Asajj Ventress had both light and dark inside of her, and Mace Windu had both light and dark inside of him, there's balance to that. But there is no light in Sidious, and there was no light in Vader or Maul. But Kylo always had light, which is why he would have never really been a Sith. The Sith are a cancer. They work outside of the lines of the Force and one's use of the Force. They are an extreme and without balance. But let's get back to the Inquisitors. Almost all the Inquisitors were former Jedi who had fallen to the dark. Many had simply started as being disillusioned with the Jedi's participation in the Clone Wars and gradually fell down the never-ending spiral of the dark side. As Yoda says, fear leads to anger, anger leads to hate, hate leads to suffering. Most were captured and tortured until they embraced the dark and wanted revenge, or simply died. Sidious was careful to ensure the Inquisitors never became too powerful. They were not trained in the ways of the Sith, instead simply using the dark side of the Force, and their spinning and, in my opinion, stupid helicopter lightsabers and armor were meant to counter their lack of skill compared to full-fledged Jedi Masters. By the time of the original trilogy, all the Inquisitors had been destroyed with little regard from Vader or Sidious, who simply thought they had served their purpose. Key to understanding the Rule of Two is understanding this. The Sith are not the only dark side users. The Sith are the most powerful and most utterly devoted. They are the cancer. Many canon stories have shown the Rule of Two, although usually through metaphor and allusions. Seasons 2 of Rebels features Malachor and shows Maul and Ezra entering a Sith temple. Lords of the Sith by Paul Kemp shows how two Sith can function together when their survival is under threat. The one last thing I want to touch on before we get out of here today are some of the Legends' takes on the Rule of Two. To be fair, it's largely the same as that's in canon. Some Siths, such as Darth Plagueis, did not believe in the rule, and Plagueis intended to live forever alongside his apprentice. It didn't go well for him. I'm not sure if you've heard, but I might as well ask, have you ever heard the tale? Darth Plagueis wise. He was so wise, he could even stop the wise from wising. Anyway, didn't fare well for the lad. Sidious kind of took control and became more of the classic example of what the Sith are. Also in Legends, the Sith returned after Return of the Jedi, and 100 years later had abandoned the Rule of Two under Darth Krayt, which I always thought was kind of cool. This was in the Star Wars Legacy story, which went way off the rails, went on far too long, and had to struggle to kind of bring itself back under control. simple, but had a ton of cool characters, not unlike a lot of other legend stories. However, what I thought was the most compelling thing about that was that Darth Krayt thought that Bane's view of the Sith was twisted, and that it shouldn't be the rule of two, but instead the rule of one. One Sith order, with everyone devoted to playing their position. Cool concept, but utterly flawed in the philosophical manner of the Sith itself, which are constantly craving power, constantly craving to be the big dog on campus. But a cool take on it nonetheless. The rule of two is most fleshed out in the trilogy of Darth Bane novels. Those are held in extremely high regard, and while nothing in them has been outright stated to be canon, canon has alluded to them many times. They're an interesting and fascinating read for anyone wanting to learn more. And I will say this, my view on Legends is it all can be true unless something in canon utterly goes against it, since they're kind of picking and choosing the old lore that they want to continue anyway. And the rule of two is something that starts in canon in the films. So I certainly don't consider it a waste of time. Plus, Zana's pretty cool. And I wouldn't mind 6-inch figures of all of them. Actually, give me 6-inch figures of every Sith ever. But I think I might have a problem. Anyway, hope you guys are staying safe. Thanks for listening. Thanks for watching. Until next time, take care.